Hello. So glad to be with you once again for us to talk about another global leadership competency. Today, we're going to talk about the fourth leadership competency, reframing the gifts of spiritual leadership. Like all of the other competencies that create the global leader, that define them, this one also has a very rich piece of content. Let's take a look at the assumptions. In the case of the spiritual gift of leadership, we're going to find in a moment that there are four gifts as listed in front of you on the screen. But before we march on to that, let me share this about it. The spiritual gifts of leadership are gifts that motivate the individual or group of individuals intrinsically. There are two types of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. In this case, the intrinsic motivator is that motivator that comes from within of the individual, or again, a group of individuals, so that they actually find a way to fulfill their biggest dreams, their own motivation, so that they then act in a positive direction accordingly. So, all of these gifts of leadership produce or provoke intrinsic motivation. Let's look at the assumptions. The first assumption, these gifts of leadership are gifts of self and soul, as contrasted with the gifts of material items or vision, thus the designation spiritual leadership. Again, they come from within, and they are leadership gifts that bring out the individual and are from the internal portion of our lives. The gifts there are four of them. The gift of authorship, the ability of the leader to have the individual or group of individuals feel like they can sign off on what they have created. It is theirs. And so therefore it engenders a tremendous amount of pride. Secondly, the gift of empowerment. That ability that the global leader has to give the individual a sense of self that gives them power to engage, power to move forward, power to believe in themselves, which is closely aligned to the other gift, the following, the gift of significance. In other words, that gift of value, that gift of being someone because of who they are, not necessarily because of who they are not or because of what others are, but because of who they are and the importance and value of that. And finally, the gift of love. Now, that might sound strange a little bit that the leader might be giving the gift of love, but in fact it is the case that the global leader understands that love motivates, and that love, as you and I understand it, also has to be authentic and genuine for it to have credibility. And so the spiritual leader engages in that gift as well. However, I want to reemphasize that though these are the four gifts, as the assumption states, the capacity here is the ability to reframe from one to the other. And we'll come some more into that. Let's look at the second assumption. It's the capacity to reframe these gifts of leadership is rooted in the spiritual domain of a human condition, and therefore it is an intuitive action. In other words, the global leader is able to intuit what it is that needs to be delivered at any given point to motivate the individual. Let's look at the third assumption. Spiritual intelligence is a requisite for reframing from one leadership gift to another. In other words, the global leader has to have such self-awareness of their own, which we've talked about already in previous competencies. The fact of the matter is that there has got to be an ability to diagnose, understand the impact of the gift that they want to deliver, and third, be able to recognize that if there is an immediate need to reframe to another gift in order to motivate positively, they can. That is a spiritual intelligence that actually is at the root of being intuitive. Number 4, The leadership dimension of reframing rests in the ability of the leader to understand that he or she has a tendency to lead from a particular frame or lens, often with a secondary frame as a flex frame, depending on a variety of factors, including leadership style, personality tendencies, and training. Now, this is a very interesting assumption because it brings to light the fact that global leaders are human like all of the rest of us, and that all of us have a tendency to be able to operate very well in giving out of one or another spiritual gift. So we may be very good at the authenticity gift, and we may tend to always like to give the empowerment gift. Fact of the matter is, though, the global leader understands, and that's what this assumption is saying, understands that they have that tendency to rest in two primary lenses or two primary gifts, one primary, one secondary, and that they tend to flex in and out of those sort of by habit. And actually, what's happened is they've become comfortable with it because their personality may lend to one or another, or because their training may lend to one or the other. But the global leader understands that they've got that tendency, but at the same time, they have a toolbox of 4 gifts, and that those 4 gifts have to be applied appropriately in order to deliver that really sharp intrinsic motivation. So here is the core of this reframing capacity, where it's a self-understanding that helps them recognize where they are comfortable, and then helps them overcome that comfort by the diagnosis that they have in understanding the situation to know which of the 4 gifts to apply best first. That is at the core of their reframing capacity. Number 5, the capacity is a ranging competency. In other words, choosing from among all 4 gifts given the circumstances to select the right gift, regardless of which one is necessary, which is what we just discussed. But the assumption basically is nailing down that inherent in the competency for reframing the gifts of spiritual leadership, that there is this constant range back and forth. I liken it like having a radar that's constantly moving back and forth and being able to, in effect, create a signal where a target must be delivered. Often beyond one's own flex gifts, again, to motivate people, groups, organizations, or entire societies appropriate to the situation. The 6th assumption: beyond a possible innate 2-frame flex, it is the ability to diagnose the situation using one's own natural flexing leadership gifts as a floating point of reference, integrating consideration of the other leadership gifts for response, decision, and action or inaction as required by the particular situation, and making use of multiple leadership gifts, sometimes simultaneously, to lead and motivate. So this assumption is a bit different from what we've just discussed, though it's so much a part of this theme, which is that the global leader understands their flex points, but more importantly, that they become a floating diagnostician, and that they have a point of reference that also must float in order to be accurate about the motivating of others. So we have a really fascinating competency, this capacity for reframing the gifts of spiritual leadership. I'm going to share with you about a story about Desmond Tutu, and just a little background to demonstrate this capacity, this competency. Of course, as you know, Desmond Tutu found himself at a unique place in time in the South African apartheid movement of the 20th century. He was both a black man But more importantly, he was the first Black Archbishop of South Africa, where prior to his being that, every Archbishop had been, in fact, white. So it sort of set the apartheid government ill at ease. Nevertheless, he was there. We also know that at this time, while he was Archbishop, as you have read in your material so far, is that Desmond Tutu um, actually served to move forward the movement, the anti-apartheid movement. Nelson Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island for 26 years. Uh, his wife, Winnie Mandela, was often his spokesperson. They later divorced. But the fact of the matter was, it was Desmond Tutu who led the movement while Mandela was in prison. Now, Mandela was always the symbol of the anti-apartheid movement, but it was indeed Tutu who was a catalyst for moving it forward during those 26 years when Mandela was imprisoned on Robben Island. So he was the de facto leader, the de facto catalyst. The story that I want to share to you is really about his influence on a group of people, really kind of a mob, and how he reframed some spiritual gifts of leadership. Chris Ahrens, who we've spoken about, who was his chaplain while he was the Archbishop, and also John Allen, who was on his executive staff while he was Archbishop, shared the unique experience about a time when Tutu appealed broadly to a mass that were there to keep the anti-apartheid movement going. The energy was intense. There were people yelling, and yet a strange thing happened. There were police there, and of course and they were white police, and that created a sense of white domination over black, and it was just a terrible situation. It was such a situation. He walked into it. This was not a meeting he was going to, but he walked into this, and it was a very serious confrontation. The police, if they had not been disciplined, could have created a massacre because they could have opened fire. There's no question about it. And so, in that situation, Tutu boldly went up to the police, of course, with this mob in the neighborhood. And there were about 300 people, according to Mr. Ahrens and Mr. Allen. And Tutu went up to the police and he says, "I'd like to borrow your megaphone." Of course, that made them very nervous. Here, they didn't quite didn't know what he would do with it. But in the sense of the moment, there was enough trust that they gave him the megaphone. And so Desmond Tutu began the process of talking to the crowd. He sort of took over the situation and he invigorated the crowd. Well, that made everybody even more nervous. And he saw that some of his fellow white bishops who were there, they got very nervous when he did that. They thought he was sort of agitating the crowd. But he had an extraordinary way of dealing with that group of people. And in doing so, he would use rhetoric in his oratory to use the crowd. So here we are, part 2 of the capacity for reframing the gifts of leadership. We had just discussed that Desmond Tutu was in a crowd, a fairly angry crowd, where police were present. And he had asked the police for the megaphone and had started speaking to them and invigorating them. And it made his white counterparts, bishops, nervous. But the fact of the matter is that he would normally take on a confrontation like this, get the people on his side, get the crowd with him, and get the crowd working in such a way to respond to him. So he'd say, "So you're confident that you're going to be free?" And he would challenge them, and they would respond, "Yes, we're going to be free." And he asked them if they were really confident about that, and they'd say, "Yes, we're very confident about that." And he asked them again whether they knew they were going to be free again, and on some day, and they would respond positively. And so it felt like he was whipping the crowd up, and then he would turn on them and say, turn in the reframing sort of way, and say, "So if you're so confident that you're going to be free, then you can be disciplined and dignified," and then would go with them with the alliances, and he would say, "If you avoid the lion, you will live to fight another day." What a marvelous, marvelous example of reframing the gifts of leadership. Because in effect, what he had done is he had taken an angry mob, and he had, in very skillful way, given them empowerment. Right? He had empowered them, but then he reframed it. So how is it that he reframed it? Well, I'd like for you to take on that challenge, and if you can tell me, because it moved them on to a very hopeful place. He gave them a sense of significance, right? That is the right place. So he gave them significance, and then he empowered them. He empowered them, then he gave them significance, and back and forth. He was able then to move what was really an angry mob into a very positive movement forward. Desmond Tutu skillfully reframes with those gifts on an ongoing basis, and I'm sure that you have seen several of those examples already in your book. The fact is that the sophistication of Tutu's intellect and capacity to reframe his spiritual leadership gifts was observed not only in angry mobs and with individuals, but at a systemic level, because he had in mind something much, much larger than redirecting an angry mob or helping and giving hope to an individual. He understood that there was more that had to be accomplished. He was, in effect, shifting the power base of the apartheid government, forcing negotiation towards a new policy. This is really the ultimate in reframing the gifts of leadership and its tremendous impact. And he was quite agile with it. Well, it's been great to be with you again today, and I look forward to speaking to you about the next capacity. We're moving right along. Please be in touch if you have any questions. Bye.